Today we're going to be talking about step 7 of translation, making a back translation in preparation for a consultant check. So here we have our 10 steps of translation: exegesis, drafting, team check, reviewer's check, community testing, basic scripture checks, and now we are on to step 7, making a back translation. So what is a back translation? Well, a back translation, or a BT, is a somewhat literal translation of a translated text in one language back into another language. So for example, Luke 2 is first translated into, let's say, the Sukha language from English versions. And then Luke 2 in Sukha is translated back into English for the consultant check. The purpose of a back translation. A back translation helps a consultant who doesn't speak the target language to understand the meaning of the translation. It gives him a window into the translation so he can check if it is accurate, clear, natural, and acceptable. Here is an example of a back translation for a language in Nepal. This is Luke chapter 2, verse 7 in the Sukha language. Here is a back translation of that verse in English. It says, "Then her first son was born. Baby son was wrapped by cloths, kept in domestic animals' feeding manger, because they didn't get any room for visiting in lodges." So a back translation is not necessarily in good English, but it is providing a window for how the text has been translated in the target language. It's a fairly literal translation back into English. In what language should you make the back translation for the consultant check? Well, the back translation should be made in a language the consultant can understand. At times, it will be in the national language, but other times it will need to be in an international language, like English. So the back translation will depend on the consultant's language ability for languages in that country. Now, the back translation can be in an international language like English, only if there is someone who can do the back translation in English, and if there's a translator on the team who speaks English well enough in order to communicate with the consultant during the check. In step 5 of translation, community testing, we mentioned that there are various methods for testing a translation. Well, one of the ways discussed is making a back translation. If the back translator sees a problem in the text, well, he should then discuss it with the other translators on the team, and they should revise the translation as necessary. They should also then update the back translation. Don't leave mistakes in your translation for the consultant to find. You should be correcting and making your text as good as it can possibly be before it comes to the consultant. Let's talk about keyboarding the back translation. A back translation can be written by hand if the person doing it prefers writing over typing, but it then needs to be keyboarded. This helps the consultant to easily read the writing, to receive the back translation from a distance by computer, and to compare the back translation in paratext against other versions. A back translation needs to go in its own project in paratext. So how do you make a back translation project in paratext? Well, in most cases, a back translation project will have already been made for you on your computer. If not, you can hit File, New Project, Edit, and enter the name of the back translation project. Then under Type of Project, select Back Translation. And under Based On, select your translation. That will preserve all the backslash codes and formatting from your project. That way the back translation will match exactly your project for things like formatting. Now, of course, you might not remember all these steps, which is fine. But if you do need to set up a back translation project yourself, you can refer back to the steps on this slide. On the next few slides, we're going to be talking about different kinds of back translations and what's most helpful for the consultant. Some back translations can be very literal, following the exact form and structure of the translation in your language. And others can be more free or meaning-based, giving the meaning of your translation. Well, the most literal type of back translation possible is called a word-for-word interlinear. So here is a Greek text, and here is a word-for-word interlinear back translation. I'll read the English here. This is following the structure of the Greek. People who write paper this, it is I, Paul, who I lie chains because head of Jesus Christ, and with Timothy, sibling our. So a very literal word-for-word back translation shows the consultant the structure of the underlying language, but it is difficult for him to understand the meaning. Now, an interlinear back translation can be helpful if a consultant is trying to learn your language, but that doesn't happen so frequently. So in most cases, an interlinear word-for-word back translation is very difficult to follow. And a freer translation is then also needed, which doubles the work in producing back translations. In my opinion, the consultant does not need to know a word-for-word gloss, because the meaning of what you've translated is more important than the structure of the text in your language. I have seen where some consultants require teams to make both a word-for-word gloss and a free translation. But I don't think it is necessary or helpful. It's a lot more work, and it doesn't have many benefits for the team. In making a back translation, we need to find a balance between a very literal translation and a very free back translation. A back translation should be fairly literal, so a consultant can see what is actually in your text. However, it also needs to make sense to him. So make necessary adjustments so that it is readable and the meaning is understandable. That's how you find the right balance between literal and meaning-based back translations. Here is an example of two back translations of Luke 10:25, one that is very literal and one that shows more the meaning. So here is a word-for-word back translation, which is a bit hard to follow. Jesus to him, God to Moses gave in the law what written was. You read have not, saying asked. So a more helpful back translation for a consultant, at least in English, would be the following. Jesus said to him, what was written in the law God gave to Moses? You have not read? So in the first word-for-word literal back translation, God to Moses gave in the law is hard to follow and understand. But in the second one, in the law God gave to Moses, that is then much more clear for the consultant to understand. So make necessary adjustments so that the meaning comes through clearly, even if the structure in the back translation does not follow the same structure in your translation. What's most important is to communicate the meaning. The consultant needs to know what your text means. If the meaning of your text isn't clear, it will be difficult for the consultant to identify potential problems and help you improve your translation. In order to make the back translation meaningful, it should be phrase by phrase rather than just a literal word by word gloss. That way, adjustments to word order can be made within phrases to make the text more readable. So let's look at adjusting the word order within a phrase. Here is an example of a too literal BT. Jesus took breads of boy 5. So that word order in the underlined phrase is a bit hard to understand. So you can adjust that word order and say, Jesus took boys 5 breads. That then is much easier for the consultant to understand. Now it's best not to adjust the order of phrases. So here is an example of a back translation where the order of phrases match the translation. When child Jesus became age of 12, according to their custom, they went to celebrate festival. So don't adjust the order of the phrases to make it more natural. For instance, like this. When child Jesus became age of 12, they went to celebrate festival according to their custom. So in natural English, according to their custom would be at the end, but it's not necessary to adjust the order of the phrases, just the word order within phrases. So in thinking about the style of the back translation, keep clause breaks and sentences as they are in the translation. So that means have commas and periods in the same place in the back translation as in your translation. Match all punctuation as it is in your translation. And as much as possible, keep the order of clauses as they are in the translation. Now, some languages have a different order. For instance, subject, object, verb, that is different than English subject, verb, object. And in those cases, more adjustments will need to be made in order to make the meaning clear for the consultant. As much as possible, the back translation should show the actual words used in your translation. So in general, the back translation should reflect the words used in your text. For example, your text might say, Jesus went into house of prayer of Jew people. So don't say in the back translation, Jesus went into the synagogue. It's better to show the consultant the actual words that you are using in your translation. Now there is a way to show a consultant the literal form being used in your translation and still give him the meaning. So where you have used an idiom or figure of speech, you can put the meaning in the text, and then you can put the literal form in square brackets. So for example, Jesus looked at blind man with pity, heavy heart in brackets, and said. So there we have the meaning with pity is in the text, and in square brackets is the literal form used in the translation in the target language, heavy heart. Now, if you just use the literal form in the back translation, heavy heart, and didn't give the meaning, then the consultant would have to ask, well, what does it mean when you say he had a heavy heart? But by putting both the meaning and the literal form in brackets, then the consultant is able to understand. So structure or meaning, which is more important, to show the literal structure of the translation in the target language, or to show the meaning in the back translation? Well, this is a constant tension in making back translations. For a consultant, it's the meaning which is more important. But don't hide issues by trying to make your back translation sound completely natural. On the next 4 slides, we'll be talking about who should make the back translation. Well, if possible, the back translation should always be made by a mother tongue speaker of the language. That way it will reflect what a native speaker understands as he reads the translation. So that means it should not be made by someone else who has learned the language, a foreigner for whom it is not their mother tongue. And the back translation should be made by someone who knows well the language into which the back translation will be made. So if it's going to be made in English, the person needs to have a good enough grasp of English in order to make an accurate back translation. It's best if the back translation is made by someone other than the translator. And that's because the original translator has already studied the passage and knows what the text should say. Now, sometimes it's not possible to find anyone except one of the translators to make the back translation. And if that's the case, then make sure that you allow some time to pass between making the original translation and the back translation. Now, there are 2 major reasons why it can be hard to find someone outside the team. The first is, doing the back translation is a big job, and if there's no money set aside in the project budget to pay someone to do it, then it's often difficult to find someone who is willing to volunteer and do it. And the second reason can be, it can be hard to find someone with sufficient language skills, for instance in English, if that's the language the back translation needs to be made in. So that also can be a challenge. Preferably, the back translation should be made by someone who does not know the Bible so well. Then they will be writing what they understand only from the translated text and not what they already know. However, an objective back translation, reflecting the text, can be made by someone even if they do know the Bible well. And finally, the back translation should be made by someone who has been trained for the task. You can train a back translator by asking him first to back translate a natural text, so not the Bible. Then go through it with him and correct it with him. Help him find the right balance between being literal, showing the word for word or phrase by phrase structure, and being understandable, making sure the meaning is coming through clearly. Now I'm going to tell you the most important principle in making a back translation, and that is this. When making the back translation, no other version of the Bible should be open. The back translator should only have open their translation project and their back translation project. If other versions are also open and the back translator is looking at those, that will then influence how he words the back translation. We've seen this many times, and it can hide problems in the translation. So this is extremely important. When making a back translation, no other versions can be open. Just your translation and just your back translation project. In Paratext, we have saved a layout for you that you can use when making a back translation. So here, the team's translated text is in the left window, and the back translation project is in the right window. Only these two versions are open, no other versions. Let's say, for example, that English is a bit difficult for the back translator. So why not get help from other English versions when making a back translation? Well, the consultant isn't checking other versions. He's checking yours. If a doctor is going to do surgery on you, should he look at someone else's X-ray or at yours? Looking at another version while making the back translation is like taking an X-ray of someone else and not the patient. The doctor has to look at the patient's X-ray, not the X-ray of someone else. And the consultant wants to see how you word your back translation. He doesn't want to see how another published English version has translated the text. Using a word or key term from another version might cover up a problem in what your text actually says. It would be better to put in the back translation, "Not sure how to say this word in English," than to look at an English version for help. So once again, the most important principle, make sure all other versions are closed when you make your back translation. So which is better, an oral back translation or a written back translation? Well, a very small number of consultants check by asking for an oral back translation on the spot, rather than a written typed back translation in advance. However, the great majority of consultants prefer a written back translation sent to them in advance. Here are the advantages of a written back translation. A written back translation helps the consultant to be better prepared by researching exegetical points in advance. So he has time to compare your translation against other versions and look in reference materials and write his notes. A written back translation helps him see where there might be multiple issues in a verse, whereas in an oral back translation, he might only be able to remember one or perhaps two. It helps him compare what was done in other similar passages. And a written back translation can help him not get so exhausted that he starts missing things, which can happen if he's trying to only do it with an oral back translation. When I talked on step 3 of translation, the team check, we talked about how the team gets together to go over and check the first draft. Well, in some cluster projects, teams might also meet regularly for a group team check and discussion. And if so, they will need a back translation for this in a language of wider communication. This back translation will then need to be updated after that group team check, in case any changes were made, before giving it to the consultant for the consultant check. Now, once you have made a back translation for the consultant, no further changes should be made to your text before the consultant check. A back translation is only made when you are completely done with your text. Once you sent your back translation to the consultant, don't make any further changes to the text. If you do, your back translation will no longer match your text. If you do see something which needs changing after you send the consultant the back translation, then insert a note in your text in order to discuss the change with the consultant. If the back translation no longer matches the text, then what the consultant is checking is not your final text, and that's not acceptable. I've had this happen multiple times with teams where I find the back translation doesn't match their text. And they say, oh yeah, we made some changes after we sent you the back translation. Well, then I'm not able to accurately check their translation. So make sure that you don't make any further changes to your text once you've submitted the back translation. Doing a back translation in advance. The back translation must be done well in advance of the consultant check. This gives the consultant sufficient time to prepare questions and suggestions. At a minimum, it should be sent to the consultant several weeks before the check. The more material that will be checked, the longer in advance it should be sent to the consultant to give him sufficient time to prepare. So you should be in communication with your consultant about how much time he'll need and when he wants your back translation available to him. Let's talk about how to send your back translation to the consultant. The team adds the consultant as a user to their back translation project in Paratext. They also add him as a user to their translation project. He'll want to see both your actual text and the back translation text. As the back translation is made, do regular send receives so that the consultant receives your text. Now remember, when doing send receives, you need to make sure that the box is checked both by your project and your back translation project. That way he'll receive updates to both. Let's talk now about how consultants write their notes for a consultant check. Some consultants will write their suggestions in a new project, so you won't see their notes before the consultant check. But it's possible that a consultant will write his suggestions in your back translation project using Insert Note. Those will be in the back translation project and not in your language project. So red flag notes in your language project are made by other members on your translation team who've inserted notes in preparation for the team check. Red flag notes in your back translation project could have been made by your consultant. If you see that the consultant has inserted a note into your back translation project, don't try to resolve that note before the consultant check. When the consultant does a send receive, you will see a red flag with their note in the back translation project, as you see in the illustration there. Don't try to change your text or resolve the note before the check. Wait and let the consultant explain it more clearly during the check. The note is for the consultant to help him remember the issue and a solution to suggest. The note is not written for the team with the intention that they will process that suggestion. Now, distance checking, where teams do resolve notes in advance of the check, is done only with very advanced teams. teams that the consultant has worked with previously on a number of occasions, and he is sure they will be able to understand his suggestions and then report back to him on the changes they have made. But for new teams, don't process the consultant's notes before the consultant check. Wait and work through them together with him so that he can explain his notes. Let's talk now about whether or not the back translation should be updated. Changes will be made to the translation during the consultant check. Should the back translation then be revised so that it now accurately reflects the new text? In some languages, the back translation is not revised because only an improved translation is in focus. Now, where I work in Asia, teams generally do update their back translation, usually during the check, or perhaps after the check. A corrected back translation can then be used by other teams for ideas, and it provides later consultants an accurate look at previous passages. So find out in advance of the consultant check what the accepted practice is, so that you'll know whether you should be updating your back translation as a result of changes made in the consultant check. Let's take a look at how Paratext tracks back translations to make sure that the back translation reflects the translated text. So first, the translation is done, and then a back translation is made. Now, if a verse in the project text changes after the back translation is made, a red X appears in the back translation at that verse. You'll see an example of this on the next slide. That shows that you need to update the back translation, that it no longer matches the translation. So here we see a back translation with a red X at verse 2. That means that after the back translation was done, another change was made to the translation, but no change was made here in the back translation. So once you have updated the back translation, if you click on that red X, that will then change it to a green check mark, like you see in the other verses. That then shows that the back translation now matches the revised translation. Here is an example of the importance of having a good back translation so that the consultant can accurately check your work. Who in this image is shooting the basketball? It's the old US president, Barack Obama. You see, the consultant's ability to identify problems in the translation is dependent on a good quality back translation. If the back translation is unclear, the consultant has to find out what the translation really says and means. In an earlier class, we talked about the qualities of a good translation, and we said it should be accurate and clear and natural and acceptable. Now, what do you think are the qualities of a good back translation? Should it also be accurate, clear, natural, and acceptable? Take a few minutes and discuss that. Well, a good quality back translation should be accurate so the consultant can see what is in your actual text. It may or may not be clear, and it probably will not be natural, although it shouldn't be so unnatural as to not be able to be understood. And it won't be acceptable necessarily. Let's talk about the unfortunate circumstance if the quality of the back translation is too poor. Now, all back translations inevitably contain some errors. However, if there are too many, the consultant might stop the check and ask you to redo the back translation before resuming the check. This does not happen very often, but it can happen. Or, for the next check, the consultant might ask to have a second person on the team check the back translation before sending it to the consultant. I have had this happen several times with different teams. Often it's because the person making the back translation, for instance, their English is not so good. So having a second person check the back translation will make it more accurate and reflect what their translation actually says. Once again, a reminder of the most important thing when making a back translation. While making the back translation, never look at any other version of the Bible. Here I have an example of an actual back translation of Luke 17 in the Sukha language. And I think by looking at this, it will help you see the style of translation that can be helpful for a consultant to receive. So I will read it. When a servant comes home from plowing field or looking after sheep, then does his master say him, "Immediately sit down for dinner"? No, the master will say, "Changing your clothes, make ready my dinner, and until I have finished eating, serve me. Then after that you can have your meal." If he does as the master commands, will he thank him? In this way, when you finish doing all you have been told to do, you also say, "We are not servant who is worthy of receiving thanks. We only did the work which we have to do." So we can tell that this is a modified literal back translation of their text. It's showing somewhat what the structure of their text is, but it's also clearly showing the meaning. And I think we see there are some things here that the consultant will want to ask about. So this back translation seems to accurately reflect their translation, and it will be helpful for the consultant in preparing questions for the consultant check. At this point in our teaching, if we were in class together and not doing this virtually, I would ask an experienced translator from a language group related to yours to come and share with you for 5 minutes on his experience with making a back translation. If you do have someone like that available, I'd encourage you to listen to what he's found helpful and what he's found not so helpful in making a back translation. Now we're going to try a back translation exercise. On the next slide, you'll see Luke chapter 4, verses 1 to 4 in an English version, the NCV. Or if you like, you can replace this with a national language version from your country. Each translator make a back translation of this text into your own language. So you'll be working individually on this. Next, compare the back translations in your team and discuss them. So here is the translation. Go ahead and pause the video, and each translator make a back translation in your own language and then discuss that. How literal you made it, how meaning-based you made it, in order to make it clear for a potential consultant. Once we have finished step 7 in our 10 steps of translation, making a back translation, we're then ready for step 8, the consultant check. So that ends today's teaching on making a back translation. This is an important step as we move the text towards being approved for publication. So may the Lord help you in this step and in all the others, that you might be able to produce a high quality translation for your people. God bless. See you next time. If you're taking this training as part of a translation workshop, you'll see in the green box on the workshop schedule that we've just finished step 7 of translation, making a back translation. In our next class session, the box in red, you'll have time to work in your language teams on a back translation of the Good Samaritan story, Luke 10:25 through 37. Now you should just make one back translation, and all the translators can work together on that. Hopefully you can finish during that class session, but if not, you will have more time in session 4, as you'll see there, that you'll have a bit more time to finish the back translation if you don't finish it during the upcoming class session.